Tasty. Hey everyone, welcome back to Catholic Pipes. Today, we're going to be talking about Ryan Foley. Some of you guys may know him as a Protestant dude who goes around and does some crazy things sometimes. And in this one situation, he invades a Catholic church to preach his version of the Bible. Now, we're not here to bash on him. Actually, there's a lot of great things that we can learn from Ryan Foley, but there's also some incredibly inaccurate things that need to be addressed. So, that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking at that viral TikTok and analyzing it. So, stay tuned.
This is heresy, the rosary. The rosary is heresy. Mother Mary is nothing. It's about knowing Jesus Christ. I'm telling you, you cannot exalt Mary. You cannot exalt Mary. Get out! You can't exalt Mary. Run from Catholicism. The rosary, and Jesus tells us to sway away from repetitive prayer. This is real heresy. And the real problem going around right now is the churches with this religion and this churchianity, and they're not even going to the biblical way of doing it.
So first and foremost, I want to commend Ryan Foley. Here's the reason why. There's a famous saying that says, action follows belief. Now, the one thing that we can learn from this is, the guy's he's got some, what's the word? Moxie, I think is what they used to use back in the 1950s. He's got some real moxie to him. He goes into this church because he's so entrenched in a particular belief of his. And he's going in there, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's going there for pure intentions. He truly believes that the Catholic Church is a false church. He truly believes that, well, he probably believes a lot of things that are false about the Catholic Church. But the point is, if we give him the benefit of the doubt, then we can assume that he's going in there to try and save people from a false belief. That's something that I think a lot of us need to take away from this. Of course, there's better ways of doing it than that, because there's, quite a spectacle that he caused that diverts people away from what his intentions are. So there's better ways of doing it. But the point being is that he's doing something out of a belief and hopefully for the love of people and their salvation. That's something that we can take away. That we need to be convicted of our own beliefs. And in doing so, have no fear to go out there and share the gospel and to share the truth and the beauty of the Catholic Church and its fullness of truth with those around us. So that's the first point. That's something that we can take away from Ryan Foley, is this intense belief that then directs our action. So that's number one. And that's the positive. And that's the only positive. Sorry. Now, let's get into what's wrong with this video. Number one, in the video, it says, don't crown Mary queen. A lot of these claims that we're going to see in here are really kind of baseless, and they're baseless to some extent, but they are based in his poor logic. So first and foremost, the irony is that these people come across, or they label themselves as biblical Christians or Bible-believing Christians. And the issue with that, or the irony, is that what they tell you 9 out of 10 times is not biblically sound. So I'm not going to get too deep into it, but let's look at the idea of Mary as queen. That's actually a biblical belief. You can actually pull that from Scripture. So I believe I've talked about this in previous videos, but if I haven't, and this is the first time hearing it, it's just a brief touching on this topic. In the Davidic kingdom, we know that the king had a queen. Every kingdom, king and queen. But what was unique about the Davidic kingdom, and maybe other kingdoms at the time, but specifically with the Davidic kingdom, is that the queen was not his wife. Because the kings had a lot of concubines or, maidens or whatever you want to call it. So there might be up to hundreds of them. So how can you call either one of these a queen when there's so many of them? So to cut through that, the mother was the queen. All right, we see this in, I believe, in Second Kings. We see that when I believe it was either David or Solomon. I'm looking so biblically illiterate right now by not knowing this off the top of my head. But remember, I'm shooting from the hip right now. Point being is that when the king came out, he had a secondary throne put to his right side that his mother would sit on. All right, and she was the queen. Furthermore, we can see from scripture that there would be times where the people of the kingdom would actually go to the queen because they knew that she had great favor with the king. And I think this is something that in our own lives we kind of experience this. And this is important to remember that the material world that we live in, it's also the way in which we can know something about the heavenly realities, believe it or not. It's very hard to sit there and talk about things that we have no experience with, that are completely in the realm of theory. So we can look at the material world around us, and it can give us clues about heavenly realities. I believe it was actually Romans chapter 1, verse 20, where there's a statement that says essentially that there's no excuse for not knowing God because all of his creation speaks of him. We can use the created world, the material world, and we can deduce the reality of God from it. And that's a very profound reality because that means there are other areas in theology that we can look to the material world to help us kind of see if there might be a correlation to the divine. And the reason why I bring that up is that maybe in your own personal life, if you have a buddy or you have some, like a family member, sometimes you might actually go to the mom of that individual in order to get what you need done. I've done this a few times where I'm trying to reach out to somebody or like friends I'm trying to reach out to, like when I was younger, and I would never get a response. And so what I would do is I would go to their mom, and the mom would then make their son or daughter respond. So we kind of see that in our lives. We do see this reality of like sometimes we go through the mom, sometimes the dad, sometimes the mom, but we usually do that to get something done. We'll go through the mom. And in scripture, that's the case as well in the Davidic kingdom. We see that they can go directly to the king, but sometimes in certain circumstances, they might go to the queen because they realize it might be easier to go through the mom to get to the son. So where this is leading is that we see that Jesus is the heir that was promised to sit on the throne of David for eternity, to create this everlasting kingdom. And so to the Jewish listener, if Jesus is the promised Messiah who's going to sit on the throne of David, they're going to realize that if Jesus is saying that he is the king, and their understanding of the kingdom comes from the Davidic kingdom, that's their understanding, that's their model for a kingdom, intuitively, instinctually, they're going to know that in some capacity, Mary is royalty. Okay? If you're going to say that that's not a plausible inference that we can make, well, that's because you're foisting your 21st century perspectives onto scripture and not looking through the eyes of the people whom were around, listening and seeing the life of Jesus firsthand. You're not looking from their cultural context. So for him saying that no, we shouldn't be doing all this stuff like crowning Mary Queen or saying that it's anti-biblical, it goes to show that this individual has not done really an in-depth dive into scripture to see where that reference is even coming from. So he goes on to say that the rosary is vain and repetitious and that Jesus warns us against that. So the interesting part is this brings up two verses. And the two verses are going to be Matthew 6, chapter 6, verses 7 through 8. That is specifically talking about the vain and repetitious prayer that he's more than likely referencing. So, we're at chapter 6. Let's go ahead and read that. And it says right here, "In praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask. Context, 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 context. We've talked about this before in an earlier video in terms of what we need to properly interpret scripture. Context and historical context is going to be very important here, because listen to what he says. It says, in praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do. Why would he bring up the Gentiles? He could just say, in praying, do not heap up empty phrases and leave it like that. But he specifically compares it to the Gentiles. Scripturally speaking, the Gentiles are synonymous with idolatry and paganism. Okay? When you hear the word Gentile and when it's referenced, it's usually in reference to their wicked practices or their pagan practices. So right off the bat, there's a very specific context. It says, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard. That's important because the Gentiles are praying to dead deities, non-existent deities. You could go as far as to say demons. So when he's saying that, he's looking at them saying they're heaping up empty phrases. They're empty or vain because they're never going to be heard because the deity they're praying to does not exist. All right? So that's a very important thing to, especially contextually speaking, that's a very important point because it gets pulled out of context so many times. They're foisting, you see a lot of people, especially Protestants, are foisting their view and their bias into the pages of Scripture. So if you have a bone to pick with the Catholic Church, you're going to be looking and you're going to look for confirmation bias. Prayer beads, prayer ropes, the same prayers being said over and over again. My goodness, that's just like Matthew chapter 6, verse 7. There it is. They're going against Scripture. And once again, they're failing to get into the meat and potatoes and the context of what that verse is actually saying and what that scene is. And here we know, once again, to make sure we really get this point driven home, the Gentiles were synonymous with pagan worship. So when they're praying to entities or deities that do not exist or might be malevolent in nature, could be demons. But yeah, of course, their prayers are vain and repetitious because it's vain because no one's going to hear them because the deities don't exist. And they're repetitious because they think that if we keep on saying these praises over and over and over again, we're going to appease these gods that don't exist. We're going to appease them. So we need to keep on saying these prayers over and over and over and over and over again in the hopes that they will hear us. The reality is they won't because they don't exist. So that's specifically in context what that verse is speaking of. To further solidify that point that it's not just vain or repetitious prayer that's against Scripture, in the same gospel, Matthew, we're going to go to chapter 26. And we're going to see something very interesting here. So, 24, 25, 26. Starting at verse 36. And I'm going to read down. And I want you to pay attention to something. So we're looking at the Garden of Gethsemane. So this is where Jesus is praying. All right? This is the scene where he is praying. So we're going to go. It says, then Jesus went to them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go yonder and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, as I will, but as thou wilt. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, thy will be done. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time. Catch this. Praying for the third time, saying the same words. He went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. Was Jesus? What was he doing? Was he doing repetitious prayer? If Matthew chapter 6 verse 7 is a blanket ban on repetitious prayer, then Jesus is contradicting himself. And we know that that's not necessarily possible. We know that the Bible is coherent and without error, which means then that if we take the Protestant view, which is a blanket ban, then we have a contradiction. But since we know there are no contradictions, that must mean that our understanding is flawed. So, the way that we reconcile this is we look and we say, okay, if Jesus is doing repetitious prayer, as we see here clearly, as the scripture clearly states, he prayed the same words 3 times, all within the same setting. He prayed the same prayer 3 times. If he's doing repetitious prayer, and we go back to Matthew chapter 26, Matthew 6, verse 7, the blanket ban on repetitious prayer, then we realize that there might be a specific context, that maybe Jesus is indeed not banning repetitious prayer, but a specific type. Or maybe he's just giving an example and he's not actually creating a ban, but really just making a comparison. Don't be like them. Because the way that they're praying is useless. Specifically because the deities they're praying to don't exist. Now, this brings us up to another interesting point, which is this idea of scripture being self-interpreting. You see, we have a lot of Protestants, not all, but some are just me and my Bible type of folks. Or we're biblical Christians. We believe in scripture alone, sola scriptura. But what we have to realize is that scripture itself isn't necessarily self-interpreting. The Bible doesn't necessarily interpret itself. It could, if we had the mind to do so. And what do I mean by this? There's clearly an example here of an individual who is what he calls a biblical Christian, and he is lamenting against the Catholic Church and saying, return to biblical Christianity. The problem, though, is that when we critically analyze what he's giving to us as biblical Christianity, we realize that he's giving us a flawed interpretation. The amount of wisdom, like you would have to have, the mind you would have to have every single verse in Scripture memorized, the historical context memorized, the different types of literature that are in there memorized and understood to a perfection, so that way when you read a verse, you can immediately in your mind pull up all the other referencing verses from the Old Testament and the surrounding New Testament. Like the kind of mind you would have to have is you'd have to have photographic memory, number one, and the mind of a supercomputer to be able to pull a feat like that off. So from the Catholic perspective, you need also not just an infallible book, but you need an infallible authority to be able to set up guardrails that allow you to interpret scripture properly, not get off into the weeds here or there. So from the Catholic perspective, you need scripture and authority combined together to help guide somebody in the correct way of looking at scripture. Now, before you look at that and you say, no, we don't, take a look at your own faith denomination, my Protestant brothers and sisters. Look at your own faith denomination. There are certain beliefs that you have within that particular faith denomination that you must adhere to belong to that particular denomination. There's a reason why there's Baptist and evangelicals, because they hold to two different sets of doctrine. There's some overlap, but if you don't believe XYZ, that is what makes you a Baptist, then you're no longer a Baptist. So the reality is that a lot of Protestants out there, you actually adhere to that particular belief of an authority. You already adhere to it, but you don't necessarily realize it. The Catholic Church is no different. We have an authority that says this is what you must believe. This is how you interpret Scripture. You as well have the same thing, which is what makes you a Baptist, an evangelical, an Anglican, or a Pentecostal, or Seventh-day Adventist, or a Calvinist, is because you must adhere to certain beliefs that have been defined by the leader or the originator of your particular denomination as an authority figure. Because they're an authority figure and they define their denomination as such, you must adhere to those. Otherwise, you're no longer considered part of that denomination. So the same thing is present in Catholicism. So a lot of us are already familiar with this concept or this idea of an authority that defines what it is to be a Christian or a particular type of Christian. So for us, we have the same thing as well. The Pope, the College of Bishops, we have this infallible tradition that helps guide what Scripture is telling us to make sure that we have the correct interpretation. Not only that, but when we look at Scripture itself, there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot, like in previous videos, the historical context, the cultural context, the traditional context, all of these things help make up what we call proper biblical exegesis or interpretation, or the drawing out in Scripture. So it's very disheartening sometimes when we see these kinds of attacks where some of these individuals are particularly clueless of their own biases or these nuances that go on into Scripture interpretation. They tend to have this belief that it's as simple as, if I read it, it's exactly what it says right there, not realizing that they're foisting their own bias, they're foisting their own ideas into the Scripture from the modern culture that they're in. They're foisting it in, not realizing that that's a terrible, and like one of the basic rules when it comes to interpreting a text is trying not to put your own bias into it, but trying to read it and then use the text to help interpret itself, as well as using outside sources to get more insight, appropriate outside sources. So, yes, just to recap, I really admire the guy and his courage. That's something that we can learn from him, is that if we truly believe what we believe about our faith, then we should be out there without fear, sharing the gospel, sharing the truth of the church with those around us. So we could take the courage that this gentleman has, and that's something that we can implement in our own lives as Christians. Number two, when it comes to this idea of biblical Christianity, we have to remember that 9 out of 10 times when people are saying that, it's really what they're saying is my interpretation of Scripture. And that's something we have to be very, very careful of. And we have to do our own homework on. If somebody's telling you they're presenting you biblical Christianity, listen to what they're saying and actually look at Scripture. Do your due diligence. Look at the context. Look at the historical context. Look at the language. And actually discern whether or not what they're telling you is what the text is actually saying. As we clearly saw when he is accusing Catholics of vain and repetitious prayer that is against the command from Jesus, and we look at the scriptural context, we realize this guy is really far off base, and that the accusation that he's lobbing is based upon his faulty understanding of those particular passages. And especially when we look at the idea of saying that, we shouldn't be crowning Mary. Well, what is that based off of? That's based off his own personal bias, because scripturally we can make a case for that. So, needless to say, for all you Catholics out there, have no fear. We sit there in the fullness of truth. That is not to mean to sit in a place of arrogance or pride per se, but it's a responsibility for us to know our faith so that we can articulate it to those around us. And be wary of those who are saying that Catholicism is anti-biblical. As we clearly saw, this is just one example, but 9 out of 10 times the accusations they're going to be bringing against the Catholic Church aren't even biblical in and of themselves, or they're based off of faulty interpretation. So always do your homework, stay steadfast in your faith, learn as much as you can, and continue to watch these videos for more education so that way you can go ahead and have more confidence in sharing the faith with those around you. I'm Kadesh Swanson, and this is Catholic Pipes.